got up in arms, but it wasn't one done out of disrespect. It was just one done to try to figure out um, why some theists, some Christian theists, were making the claim of God's perfection. Now, I would like to get your take on this, which is pretty interesting. My argument was most Christians, I think, um, especially the evangelicals that we meet online, would say without question that God is perfect. And when I mean by perfect, he is objectively perfect. Everybody would agree that God is perfect. I've heard, everybody from Veckel to whoever else make that particular claim about God's perfection. So I elaborate and I ask, well, if that is the case, how are you judging that God is perfect? Um, and I'll give an example. Let's say I have someone who I say makes cars perfectly. They only make perfect cars. But the only cars that I've ever seen them make were cars that were imperfect. Cars that everyone agreed that were imperfect. So then I would ask the question, well, if this guy who you are saying is a perfect car maker only makes all imperfect cars, then how are you saying this is a perfect car maker? What guides you to that conclusion? It seems to be an empty claim. So I'll translate that to the God question in a sense that all people, nature, everything that God has created seems to be imperfect. In the other hangout, the Christians agreed nature's imperfect, man is imperfect, everything that's been created, even angels, were imperfect because they fell. If they weren't if they were perfect, they wouldn't have fallen. So, with that in mind, how is God's perfection? Is it just an baseless assertion without any real evidence or logic, or can someone make an argument that God is perfect with the
Yeah,
facts that I just outlaid?
yeah. I mean, of course, there's an obvious argument that does have that conclusion, or would have that as part of its argument, and that's the modal ontological argument, where the greatest conceivable being exists, and that greatest conceivable being has great making properties, and a great making property would be perfection. So just by you could say that if God is defined as the greatest conceivable being, then God is perfect, and that would follow. Or you can claim God is perfect via not our observation of what He's created, but via His own self-revelation as to His nature. So if God exists and God reveals Himself to humanity in some way with respect to its nature, then God can reveal, I am perfect. And if you have confidence in the revelation, then you'll have confidence in that declaration. And that's two ways that come to my mind. One's an argument from the definition of God as the greatest conceivable being, and the other is via self-revelation.
Well, my objection to both of those rebuttals was number one, um, I, I can define, if we're talking about definitions, I would be able to just define, anything as being perfect and then use that as what most people are calling the objective standard. So I would dismiss just defining God as being perfect, just like I would dismiss anyone else defining any other being as being perfect. You know, it's true. It could be an argument. Well, we're just defining him as perfect, but I don't think that's really fostering, moving the conversation forward. I would say with the self-revelation, which I do agree with, someone can have some type of self-revelation that leads them to believe that God is perfect. But even when you're talking about self-revelations and things that are personal to the being, that can really never be shown or proved to someone else. They can say, well, I know God is objectively perfect, but that, it's kind of vacuous when you're trying to say, okay, well, demonstrate to us how you come to this conclusion. It's just like someone saying, I was abducted by aliens. To them, that's true. And, if they took a lie detector, that would be true to them. But I don't know if that would be true in reality. So my response is that I am not, the claim that God is perfect, I am not saying it's not true. I want to be very clear with that. But I'm saying I think it's just not supported because all the evidence that we have of everything that this God has made has been, and I will ask you the question, has been objectively not perfect, imperfect, matter of fact. And if that's the case, how what's how would you defeat that argument that the perfection that they say God has is objectively demonstrated not to be? Because in the world,
Well, first of all, the perfection that God has isn't related to his creation. So there's no claim by certainly Christian theologians that God has created things perfect. So if you look at the world, the universe, and you don't see anything perfect, that's consistent with Christian revelation or Christian theology. They don't claim that God's creation is perfect. So there's nothing to gain from looking at the world and saying the world isn't perfect. Well, that would be like a car dealer saying, hey, I make cars, but I don't make cars perfectly. And then you looking at the car and say, hey, this car's not perfect. Well, that's what they said. They've already predicted what you're feeding back to them. So yeah, I don't think you get any purchase from looking at the world and then trying to evaluate whether God is perfect or not by doing that. I don't think that's helpful. But on the first one, I don't think you can name something else, some other being, where people would consider it realistically to be perfect. Of course, you can do it. You can do it arbitrarily. You can do it like you can say, well, the invisible pink unicorn is perfect by definition. You can make up all these kind of stories about perfect beings. The thing is, though, we have a God claim, a serious claim in the philosophy of religion that this thing exists. And given that claim, you're looking for what are the possible ways that you could talk about God's perfection. And one of the ways you can do that is by not saying, hey, I'm going to define God as perfect. That's not what's been done. The definition is that God is the greatest conceivable being, and that is an actual definition of God. The modal ontological argument is predicated on that definition. And the greatest conceivable being, you then ask, well, which is greater? So a being greater than none other you can conceive. So if I conceive of a perfect being, then I couldn't conceive of a more perfect being than a perfect being. And God is the greatest conceivable being, so by definition, then God would have that as a great making property. And the second one's about self-revelation. And self-revelation is just talking about what is a possible way that God's perfection could be known. You seem to move into how it's known, but I'm talking about how it could be known. And it would be perfectly within the scope of possibility for God to reveal himself and his attributes. So God could reveal himself as, I am a perfect being. And I think that's two ways you can reason to God as one way you can reason to it, the second way it can be done by self-revelation. And I think that's how Christian theology does it.
sorry, just give me 1 second. I'm taking care of a baby real quick.
I hope I'm not breaking up.
Yeah, I think it was me. Sorry. I left and came back just in case. How are we defining perfection? Or
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Like, for example, like I'll hear some people say that God is perfect and that like perfection is like the meeting of an end, right? So God, like the end of God is himself in some sense, because like, this might be related to divine simplicity or something like that. But like that's a more classical theistic approach to things?
Well, I'm taking it as a primitive definition, just basically meaning without any defects, without any flaws, without any fallibility, and so minus any of those. So he is the completion of all. He's the completion of everything that's perfect. You can't use perfect in the definition, but there is no deficiency in the being called God.
Yeah, we're using a very colloquial definition, but I think
that's a good definition.
When someone says God is objectively perfect or perfect, I think that would clarify what matters.
I would argue that the notion of meeting an end and the notion of flawlessness are related, because then you could say, well, flawlessness with respect to what? And it's like, well, this is what it's supposed to be, and this is what it is, and they're the same thing. So what it's supposed to be is kind of the end, and then what it is whether or not you've met the end, and it just happens to be without it is what it's supposed to be without any flaw, without any deviation from what it's supposed to be. And so in that sense, you could say perfection and meeting of an end are related. Yeah. I have no problem with it.
But then that would open it up. That would make everything perfect then.
I don't think. What
did you say?
I think he said that would make everything perfect. I don't see how that would.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to understand. Because if you're saying it's just, can you state the definition that you were trying to explain one more time?
So I'm just going to talk for a bit to say if it's me who's breaking up or if it's MP. Am I breaking up or anything?
No, you're not breaking up.
Oh, so I was breaking up. I'm sorry.
No, nobody's breaking up from my side.
Yeah, I hear you. I hear everybody clearly too. I don't know.
I think it's something like with my connection or something. I'll just have to deal with it. The reason it wouldn't require that everyone be perfection is you could just ask, well, how what is the ideal in a given case? What is the standard of which you're trying to meet? For any arbitrary standard, you might so if the standard is nothing other than the way things are. So if what something should be just is how it is, if we've defined how you ought to be as how you are, then everything's perfect. But when I was saying that God is how he ought to be, I'm not saying that. In a sense, you could say God being the standard of all good, he must be how he ought to be. Like there is no distinction there. But on the other end, you could say that not only must God be what he ought to be, but there's nothing else that he could have an obligation to be or something.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I thought you were finished. I apologize. I just want to, in speaking with these claims, with the claim, because I've been trying to. Sometimes in these conversations, when you're trying to make points, sometimes you lose the other person's point because you're trying to argue for one side, but not really trying to listen for the other side. So I want to make sure I don't do that. So I'm trying to keep up with everything. The first thing, going back to what Matt said earlier, Matt was talking about defining God in this way, and I think he's correct in that sense. The best possible perfect being, or the
greatest conceivable
being. Greatest conceivable being, yeah. But and I think my objection is not one of a definition, but one of supporting a claim, because the claim is one of perfection, and I'm trying to either find support for that claim or say that claim is just an assumption. Now, I agree that if you define God that way, then you would have to use that within that definition, because that definition tends to force you to say that God is perfect in that way. But in trying to support such a claim, I would say then, okay, if everybody's pointing to this one possible being as being perfect, and then saying everything that has derived from that one perfect thing is imperfect, then my only response would be, number one, what standard are we using for perfect? Because it seems like the standard for perfection is outside of this God and everything else, because we deem everything else as being not perfect and God as being perfect. And then the second thing I would ask is that, wouldn't it be more reasonable to believe that this God is imperfect, because everything that he's created is imperfect.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think on the first point, the argument that, I mean, I think you seem to be conflating two things. How is it possible that a Christian or a theist could have a perfect God and giving evidence that such a being exists? And those are two different subjects. I'm dealing with the former subject, which is saying, well, here's two ways that a Christian could say they know that God is perfect. Now, that's granted that God exists, so you'd be a conditional statement. If the God of Christianity exists, then the God of Christianity is perfect, because the God of Christianity is the greatest conceivable being. And that's a great making property of the greatest conceivable being. So that's a way that it could be done. Or if the God of Christianity exists, then the God of Christianity could reveal to humanity that he has the attribute of perfection. That's a second way, but both of those are saying if God exists. You seem to be asking, well, how do you demonstrate God does exist? But that would be independent from the ways by which God could be, if he existed, objectively perfect.
All right. Well. I have no choice but to accept, especially if you're defining the entity in that way. I have no choice but to accept the definition. But I would say, if the attribute that you're trying to ascribe to this being is one that's of perfection, and it's something that's real and something that's not, it's almost definitionally true. But if you're trying to assign the characteristic or the adjective of perfection to this being, I would just ask for support for that particular claim. Now, I do agree that it is more than possible that it is true that God is perfect. I do not doubt that. But support for that claim is what I'm challenging, and not the actual truth of it. And I know it seems almost slimy to say that, but it's true. I'm actually trying to find out, well, what support does this claim have that we would use? Because as my older example, and maybe it's because the example doesn't work, maybe because the God concept is different than concepts in regular reality. But when I first bought this idea, I said, well, if I have someone who creates cars or creates any object, and we're saying that person is perfect in every way in making these things, then I would suspect everyone that he's made must be perfect, or he's at least made one that is perfect. So I can say, okay, this is the perfect one. So now, if that guy who makes bottles of water, if everyone he's ever made is imperfect, then I don't believe I am rationally justified in saying he's perfection, even if I define him as being perfect.
But your analogy,
that wouldn't be perfect.
Your analogy is invalid. It's not a valid analogy, because it's not predicated of God that what he creates will be perfect. You're saying that you've got this perfect car making, and every car they create will be perfect. Therefore, whenever you see a car, it's going to be perfect. But that doesn't carry over to God, because it's not predicated of God that what he creates will be perfect. So I don't know where you're getting the analogy from there.
Okay, and maybe you're right. Maybe it's just because I'm thinking of it incorrectly. Because I was just thinking, if something is perfect, that they would have some way to demonstrate it. If we're saying God's created everything on the planet, everything on the universe, everything that we see, feel, and touch, God has created.
But then
and we're calling God perfect. Now, I agree with you. That doesn't mean that he's not perfect. But I believe a person will be rationally justified in saying this perfect being has created nothing but imperfection. So it would be reasonable to say, well, God's not perfect, and this is the reason why. Then someone saying God is perfect because I'm defining him as perfect. So I agree. We are talking about two separate instances, but I do believe that just based on the evidence that the Christian is providing, everything that's ever been created not being perfect, then how are you coming to the opposite conclusion? It's just like me saying, every time I jump out of a plane, I fall to the ground, and then you come to the conclusion, well, if you jump out of the plane, you'll go up. You know, it just doesn't, the logic just doesn't seem to follow for me.
Yeah, but what doesn't follow is because God has not done something, that God doesn't have the ability to do that thing. So God can have the ability, let's say God exists, and God exists as a perfect being, and he has the ability to make a perfect universe. The fact he doesn't create a perfect universe doesn't in any way entail he could not have created a perfect universe. So it just doesn't follow that because when we observe the universe, which is supposedly the creation of God and everything in it, that it's not, that all we see is imperfection, that God himself is not perfect. For that to be the case, it would need to be predicated somewhere on Christian theology that God is perfect and everything God creates is perfect. Or something like, if a being has the property of perfection, then everything it creates will also have that property. And I don't see how any of those two logically follow.
No, but I just want to be clear. I'm not saying that everything he has to create must either be perfect or have some element of perfection. Because if that was the case, then there would be no way for us to judge what's perfect and imperfect. You know, if he made everything perfect. So I would say that even just one example of perfection would be enough. You won't need to have every example of perfection out there, because one example would then allow you to say, okay, well, this is an imperfection and this is perfection, and it had to be made. Now, some people will point to Jesus and saying, well, Jesus is that symbol of perfection. You know how you can judge it, but then Jesus was God. Most Christians will tell you Jesus was God himself. He wasn't created; he was God. So then that throws us right back into the same loop or the same reasoning.
But
Well,
you don't
okay.
get it. I mean, when God creates the universe, or the heavens and the earth on the last day, he says, and God looked at that which he had created, and it was very good. It doesn't say and it was perfect. So for your argument to work, you need to have some way to say because what you're doing is you're basing this on observation. You're looking outside into created things, and you're looking for an example of perfection. But if it's not predicted on Christian theology that you will find something perfect apart from God himself, so you won't find any created thing that's perfect, then you not finding anything that's perfect is consistent with Christian theology. So there's no argument there against Christian theology, because what you are doing is affirming Christian theology. Christian theology is saying apart from God, there is nothing else which has the property of perfection, and you're saying everything we observe is imperfect. So that's just affirming what's predicated on Christian theology. So I don't think you can argue against the perfection of God in the way that you're doing. You need to attack something like the greatest conceivable being and the property of perfection, but it seems obvious that a being that is perfect is greater than a being that's imperfect. Or you need to attack the idea of self-revelation, which are the two ways I've mentioned where God can reveal himself to be perfect if he exists. And remember also that Christians do predict that perfection will exist, not that it does exist, but it will exist when Christ returns and there's a new heavens and a new earth, and Christians are raised to glory and sanctification, and they are changed, their body, the imperfection puts on perfection. So that's predicted on Christian theology, but it's not predicted that anything you see will be perfect. And all you're doing is pointing to the truth of that. Everything you see is imperfect. So I don't think that's a useful way for you to argue if you're trying to argue against the Christian theological view that God is perfect. And that's not even touching on Thomas Aquinas and Thomas Aquinas, what he would be arguing about the perfections of God. which would
Well,
be a
just
third way.
well, just to be clear, what I'm arguing for is a reason why. If you're saying that something has that particular attribute, what's the reason why you come to that particular conclusion? And you did make two arguments. You made the God is the greatest possible being argument, and saying, well, by definition, if he's the greatest possible being, he must be perfect. And I don't even really know how you could even judge this God as the greatest possible being, or even just give it that attribute of perfection. But I'll even grant that. But then we went to personal revelation. And again, I don't know how I can argue against that, because even in that particular circumstance, you can go out there to Arizona right now and meet people who've actually been abducted by aliens now, who can tell us right now that's their personal experience. And if someone does have that experience, there's no way that I can either say that they've had this that they've had this particular experience. I can't, someone can't describe their interactions with God with me.
But I'm
it's
not
something
talking
that
about experiences. So that would be a misunderstanding.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I'm talking about
What are you
God
talking about?
So like for example, let's say here's one possible. This is going to the extreme, but God could rearrange the stars to spell out the message, I am perfect. And everyone would observe that. Now that's not something we do observe, but that's one way God could do that. And that would be independent of individual private experiences. It would be observable by every human being on the face of the planet who had eyes to see. Another way he could do it is he could give general revelation. So he could do general revelation through nature, or through our ability to reason, or he could do that through special revelation. So he could inspire the scriptures to be written, and part of the scriptures to contain that revelation. So neither of those, you have access to the Bible, and that every human being, nearly every human being would have access to the Bible, and therefore there's a general revelation out there. So it's not about your experience, so your alien thing kind of falls down there, which is a private personal experience that can't be checked by anyone else. You can read the Bible and you can see whether the Bible has any claims in that about God's revelation that he's perfect. Now, that's assuming, again, God exists, but that's what we're talking about. If God exists, how could God reveal his perfection, or how could we conclude that God is perfect if that God exists? Well, through the Bible or through any other writings. So it's not about personal experience. I'm not saying individuals experience the perfection of God. I don't know how that would, I don't even think that could be done. I don't think you can experience someone, if God was perfect, I don't think you could experience that. It's about God taking action to reveal to humanity, the whole of humanity, that he has the attribute of perfection. Not about personal experience.
Well, you know what? Take my argument for what it's worth, and I'm going to just spell it out so it's very, very clear. If I go to a restaurant and there's a cook, and every meal that cook made for me was bad, and not only that, every meal that he's ever made that I know about, that you know about, that everybody that knows about that this cook has made is bad, and then I come up to the conclusion that this is a good cook, I would say that person who's saying that's a good cook is irrational. And that person not only saying it's a good cook, he's saying that's the best cook ever. That cook is the greatest possible cook. Him. And the only thing I've ever eaten, and anybody's ever eaten, is things that are actually bad. He's cooked them poorly.
But again, that's about
so if I can just change the word cook to the word God, I think I don't see how it doesn't follow. And maybe you're right. Maybe there's something different there. But I think just the reasonable person would say this isn't the greatest possible cook, because he's only made things that are not good. It's pretty bad, matter of fact. Not to say he's not the greatest possible cook. He could be. He could just be doing this on purpose. but I don't think I'd be rationally justified in saying he's a good cook.
Now, the problem with that is that you're now equating imperfection with badness, and that doesn't follow. I mean, like when in the scriptures, when God looks upon his created order, he doesn't say, and God looked upon what he had created and it was bad. He says it was very good. Now, very good is not the same as perfect, but it's not bad. And I think that's what you're doing with your analogy there. You're going from the cook who everything he cooks is bad. Well, imperfect food is not necessarily bad food. I've had lots of food that tasted absolutely delicious, but it wasn't perfect. It probably had some flaws in it here and there, but it wasn't bad food. So you can't move from imperfection to badness without some sort of argument to do that. And again, we're not talking about what we're talking about what God is, not by his action, which is what you're saying. You're trying to evaluate the perfection of God by his actions, his creation of the universe, and I've already told you that's a wrong way to go about it. There's no prediction that God, if he exists on Christian theology, there's no prediction that what he creates will be perfect. It will be imperfect. You're pointing to imperfection. So that's just, I don't think there's any productive way for your argument to go there that's going to work for you. But the main point there is imperfection is not equal to bad.
Yeah, I agree. I agree that the word bad and imperfect move from perfect to bad, but I could even restate the same analogy. Instead of using bad, I would just use perfect and not perfect. I still think it holds true, but I agree. I think at this point we were just banging the hammer into the same nail, because I think 99% of the experiences that you have in your life, when somebody tells you something or gives you a claim that something is the case, this guy is the greatest whatever, and you find out that every time this guy's the greatest basketball player ever, and you were to find out that this guy not only hasn't ever played basketball, but is the worst basketball player that he's only played bad basketball. It's just, I am not even challenging the fact that you're right, that God can be perfect if you just define him that way. But I'm just challenging the fact that I think when somebody does make that claim, they're making it on a faith-based assumption rather than a reasonable inference.
But again,
that's really what my argument.
But again, you fall into the same error that you've been corrected on at least twice now. There is no prediction on Christian theology that the activity of God in creating the universe, which includes all the contents of the universe and every occurrence within the universe, will be perfect. Christians are not claiming that God is perfect based on the actions of God in creating the universe. So all these analogies to basketball players and cooks and motors, they're all invalid analogies. They're false analogies. Christians are making the claim that God is perfect, not based on the observable universe and things in the observable universe, what God has created, but through the lines of reasoning I've given you. By God being the greatest conceivable being, perfection is one of the great making properties our greatest conceivable being would possess, and also through his general revelation to humanity. Those are two of, I think, at least two of three, because I think Aquinas has a separate argument to God's perfection, but I'm not overly familiar with that. But that's the two ones that, so if you're going to attack if you're going to try and argue against Christian theologians' descriptions of God as perfect, you have to go after that in a way that's consistent with how they're describing it. And all your arguments so far, I don't think have done that. They're attacking a straw man, like as if God's perfection is, on Christian theology, God's perfection is supposed to be represented by what we see in creation, especially a fallen creation. So God creates the universe, very good, and then the fall happens and the whole universe is affected by the fall, and then you're pointing to that and saying, there you go. God can't be perfect because look at this and look at that. Well, that's Christian theology saying, yeah, I agree with you, but you're just looking at our reasons for believing God is perfect in a way that we are not presenting. We agree with you that when we look at the fallen universe, we see imperfection. We don't use the fallen universe as an example of God's perfection. So I think you need to try and find another way to go after that.
So how would you since we're not using the fallen universe or anything within it, I'm supposing too. How would you then resolve the problem?
I don't see there is a problem, but what problem is there?
Well, because the evidence that I was providing was just everyone's on the planet's Earth ever experienced, and even Christian theology as a counter to Christian theology. In other words, it makes this claim, but it also makes this claim, one of perfection, but one of everything that this being is created of imperfection. So how do you reconcile these two claims? But now you're saying that we can't use anything from the world or from the universe to support the claim of imperfection or perfection. So I'm asking you then, how would you support the claim? Unless you're just saying by definition, but a definitional argument isn't just reason, that's just making a claim. So what support would you then point to?
No, well, first of all, unless you think it logically follows that if a perfect being exists, then what that being creates will be perfect. I mean, I don't think that follows. Just because a being is perfect in itself, it doesn't prevent it from creating something imperfect. You can have a great scientist who, although not perfect, is very adept. A great scientist could create a very good model of the universe, but they could also choose to present a very bad model of the universe. So I don't think you're going to get much leeway from that.
But can you? I just want to cut in real quick because I'm not making. I just don't want you to continue to. It's just a little straw man because I'm not saying that God. I'm not trying to take away God's ability to make choices. That's why I'm not saying that God, if He was perfect, He could only make perfect things. I'm agreeing the fact that God could choose to make something imperfect. I do not disagree with that. But what I'm saying is the ability for you to judge God's perfection. You've claimed it. And you have two competing things going on in one document. You have one is saying this being is perfect. Then on the second part of it, premise two is saying, but everything that's being created, everything that you've ever experienced in this world in any way from this being is imperfect. So how it's, and I'm asking a reconciliation between those two claims. I'm not asking for anything else, but these two claims seem to be irreconcilable because
there's no conflict between those two claims. In fact, on Christian theology predicts the second situation. Christian theology makes a prediction or makes a claim, a perfect God exists. That God has created a very good universe, not perfect, a very good universe. That universe is fallen, so we are not going to see in the universe anything which is perfect. So there's no conflict there between looking at the universe and seeing imperfect things and the perfection of God. That's what Christianity says will be the case. Christianity says if you look at the universe, you are going to see imperfection. You're not going to see perfection. So you then say, well, okay, so how are Christians getting to the perfection idea? And that's through the two means that I gave you, through the greatest conceivable being and the general revelation of that God to the whole of humanity, which are independent from any observation that you see in the universe.
Well, I just think for this point, we just have to agree to disagree. But I do accept the point that you made, and I'll think about it a little bit more because I just don't get it.
Cool.
But as you know, at least I just want to be honest with that. The second